In the summer of 64 AD, the smell of burning timber and melting bronze overwhelmed the city of Rome. For 6 days and 7 nights, the great fire raged, consuming 10 of the city's 14 districts. The chaos was absolute. The screams of the dying were drowned out only by the crashing of ancient temples and the roar of the inferno. Emperor Nero watched from his palace, not playing a fiddle as the rumors say, but calculating. He was calculating the cost. The Roman Empire was the master of the known world, but in the ashes of its capital it faced a bill it could not pay. The treasury was bleeding. The legions needed their wages. The grain dole for the poor had to be purchased. And now the greatest city on earth had to be rebuilt from scratch. Nero needed money. He needed an amount of silver that simply did not exist in the vaults. It was in this moment of desperation that Nero made a decision. It was a quiet decision, made in a back room with his mintmasters. It wasn't a battlefield defeat. It wasn't a political assassination. It was a mathematical adjustment, a tiny tweak. He ordered the mint to reduce the purity of the silver denarius, the reserve currency of the entire world, by a mere fraction. He lowered the silver content from 98% pure to roughly 93.5%. He also reduced the weight of the coin from 3.8 grams to 3.4 grams. To the average Roman citizen buying bread in the market or a soldier gambling in a tavern in Gaul, the new coin looked the same. It felt the same. It shone with the same face of the emperor. But something fundamental had broken. That decision, that roughly 5% reduction, was the mistake. It was the crack in the dam. It was the moment the Roman state decided it could steal from the future to pay for the present. Nero didn't know it then, but he hadn't just debased a coin. He had signed the death warrant of the Roman Empire. This is the story of how that 5% mistake spiraled into the greatest financial collapse in human history. To understand why this specific moment in 64 AD was so catastrophic, we have to understand what the world looked like before it. We have to go back to the gold standard of the ancient world. Under the first emperor, Augustus, who reigned from 27 BC to 14 AD, the Roman economy was a miracle of stability. The denarius was the dollar of antiquity. If you were a merchant in India, a trader in Germania, or a shopkeeper in Egypt, you accepted the denarius because you knew exactly what it was. It was a specific weight of almost pure silver. For nearly a century, the system worked because the trust was absolute. The exchange rates were locked. 1 gold aureus was worth exactly 25 silver denarii. This fixed exchange rate created a stable environment for trade that spanned 3 continents. A merchant could load a ship with olive oil in Spain, sail to Judea, sell it, and know exactly what his profit would be in silver. There was no inflation. In fact, prices in the early Roman Empire were remarkably stable. A tunic that cost 15 denarii in 10 AD likely cost 15 denarii in 50 AD. The stability allowed the empire to flourish. It allowed for long-term planning, for banking systems to emerge, and for the accumulation of genuine wealth. But this stability relied on discipline. It required the emperor to live within his means. If the emperor wanted to build a new aqueduct or launch a new war, he had to tax the people or find new silver mines. He could not just print money. The money supply was limited by geology. There was only so much silver in the ground, and mining it was slow, dangerous work. This physical constraint kept the government honest. Then came Nero. When he took the throne in 54 AD, the empire was rich, but Nero was expensive. He was a populist. He wanted the people to love him, and the way to a Roman's heart was through bread and circuses. He spent lavishly on games, on gifts to the Praetorian Guard, and on his own golden house. By the time the Great Fire hit in 64 AD, the treasury was already strained. The fire was the breaking point. When Nero looked at the pile of silver in his treasury, he saw a limitation. He had, let's say, 1 million denarii, but he had 2 million denarii worth of expenses. In a world of hard money, he was bankrupt, but his advisors gave him a seductive alternative. If they took the existing coins, melted them down, added 10% base metal like copper, and reminted them, they would suddenly have 10% more coins. It seemed like magic. It was free money. Who would notice? The drop from 100% silver to 90% silver is hard to detect with the naked eye. The coin still rings when you drop it. It still looks shiny. So the order was given. In 64 AD, the mints of Rome began churning out the new, lighter, debased denarius. This was the original sin of Roman economics. At first, the plan worked beautifully. Nero paid the troops. He rebuilt Rome. The economy seemed to boom because there was suddenly more money circulating. But economics has laws, just like physics. You cannot create value out of thin air. By increasing the number of coins without increasing the amount of goods and services, Nero had ignited the spark of inflation. It started slowly. A merchant in Pompeii might notice that the new coins from Rome looked a little different, perhaps a little duller after a few weeks. But the real problem was something called Gresham's law. This is an economic principle that states bad money drives out good. As soon as people realized that Nero's new coins had less silver than the old coins of Augustus or Tiberius, they stopped spending the old coins. Imagine you have two coins in your pocket. One is pure silver, the other is 90% silver, but the government says they are both worth 1 denarius. Which one do you give to the tax collector? You give him the bad one, you keep the good one, you bury the pure silver in a pot in your garden because it has higher intrinsic value. Within a few years of Nero's reform, the high-quality silver coins of the early empire began to vanish from circulation. They were hoarded, melted down, or exported to India and China, where merchants were smart enough to demand only the old, pure silver. The Roman economy was left awash in Nero's debased currency. When Nero died in 68 AD, he left behind a dangerous precedent. He had shown every future emperor that if you run out of money, you don't have to cut spending or raise taxes. You just have to mix a little more copper into the melting pot. And once you start that process, it is nearly impossible to stop. The emperors who followed Nero tried to hold the line, but the temptation was always there. The real acceleration of this disaster began with the emperor Septimius Severus in 193 AD. Severus was a military man. He won the throne through civil war, and he knew that the only thing keeping him alive was the loyalty of the legions. On his deathbed, he famously told his sons, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." Enriching the soldiers was expensive. Severus raised the military pay from 300 denarii a year to 500 denarii. That is a 66% raise. The Roman Empire had about 300,000 to 400,000 soldiers. This was a massive explosion in government expenditure. There was no way the tax base could support it. The economy hadn't grown by 66%. The silver mines hadn't increased production by 66%. So Severus did exactly what Nero did, but he went much further. He debased the denarius from roughly 80% purity, where it had drifted over the last century, down to roughly 50% purity. Let that sink in. In the span of a few generations, the world's reserve currency had lost half of its value. The coin was now only half silver. The rest was copper or bronze. Now the consequences became visible. Prices began to rise not by a fraction, but significantly. The soldiers, who had just received a 66% raise, found that their new salary didn't buy 66% more goods. It bought roughly the same amount, or perhaps even less, because the merchants raised their prices to match the flooded money supply. This created a feedback loop of doom. The soldiers would complain that their pay wasn't enough because of inflation. The emperor, afraid of a coup, would raise their pay again. To afford the pay raise, the emperor would debase the currency further. This would cause more inflation, which would lead to more demands for pay raises. By the time Emperor Caracalla took power in 201 AD, the system was straining. The denarius was becoming so pathetic, so small and debased, that Caracalla decided to introduce a new coin entirely, the Antoninianus. This was marketed as a double denarius. It was bigger, heavier, and looked impressive. It had the emperor's face wearing a radiate crown, symbolizing the sun, but it was a lie. The Antoninianus was valued at 2 denarii, but it only contained the silver content of 1.5 denarii. It was an institutionalized scam. The government was officially saying that 1.5 equals 2. They were overvaluing their own currency by law. This was the turning point where the Roman economy shifted from a trust-based system to a force-based system. In the past, people used Roman money because it was good money. Now they used it because if they refused, a soldier would kill them. But markets are powerful things. You can force a man to accept a coin, but you cannot force him to sell his wheat for it at the price you want. Merchants began to demand more and more of these double denarii for the same goods. The inflation started to tick up from 5% a year to 10%, then 20%. This destroyed the middle class. The Roman middle class was built on savings. They held their wealth in cash assets. When the value of that cash evaporated, so did their status. The only people who could survive were the super rich who owned land, real assets, and the peasants who had nothing to lose anyway. But the true horror was yet to come. We are approaching the crisis of the 3rd century, a period where the Roman Empire nearly collapsed completely. This is where the 5% mistake of Nero metastasizes into a terminal cancer. Between the years 235 and 284 AD, Rome saw more than 20 emperors rise and fall. Most were murdered. This political instability meant that every new emperor needed immediate cash to bribe the troops who put him in power. They didn't have time for long-term economic planning. They needed gold and silver now. The mints were running hot day and night. The silver content of the coins crashed. Under Emperor Gallienus in the 260s AD, the unthinkable happened. The denarius, the coin that had once ruled the world with 98% purity, was debased to 5% purity. 5%. It was no longer a silver coin. It was a copper slug washed in a thin layer of silver acid to make it look shiny for a few weeks. Once the wash wore off, the deception was revealed. The Roman government was essentially counterfeiting its own currency on an industrial scale. The banking system collapsed. Why would you lend money to someone if the money they pay you back with in 5 years is worthless? Credit vanished. Trade routes broke down because foreign merchants refused to accept this worthless copper trash. The complex, interconnected economy of the Roman Empire, which allowed pottery from Gaul to be sold in Syria, disintegrated into local subsistence economies. People stopped using money. They went back to barter. Imagine the mightiest empire in history, with paved roads, aqueducts, and massive colosseums, where the citizens are trading chickens for shoes because the money has no value. By the year 270 AD, the Roman economy was effectively dead. The currency was a ghost. The silver denarius, the symbol of Roman power, had become a copper token with a microscopic wash of silver that rubbed off on your thumb. Prices were skyrocketing not by the year, but by the week. The Emperor Aurelian tried to stop the bleeding. He was a brilliant general known as the restorer of the world for reuniting the fractured empire, but when he turned his eyes to the economy, he faced an enemy he could not stab. Aurelian discovered that the rot went deeper than just bad policy. It was criminal. The workers at the Mint of Rome, the very people responsible for creating the money, had been stealing the silver intended for the coins and replacing it with cheap bronze, pocketing the difference. When Aurelian tried to shut down this corruption in 271 AD, the mint workers didn't just strike, they launched a full-scale armed rebellion. It sounds insane to us today, government bureaucrats fighting a war against the emperor, but the Felicissimus revolt was a bloodbath. 7,000 soldiers died on the Caelian Hill in Rome just to regain control of the money printer. That is how addicted the system had become to the corruption. But the true pivot point, the moment where the Roman economy shifted from crisis to totalitarian nightmare, arrived with Emperor Diocletian in 284 AD. Diocletian was a man of systems. He realized that the chaos of the last 50 years had to stop. He looked at the inflation, which had seen the price of wheat rise by over 15,000% in a century, and he decided to fight it with the brute force of the state. He tried to reissue a good silver coin, the Argentius, at 96 coins to a pound of silver. It was a noble attempt to return to the standards of Nero's early days, but it failed immediately. Why? Because Gresham's law struck again. As soon as the government released these new, high silver coins, the citizens hoarded them and spent their old, worthless copper coins. The good money vanished into pots in the ground, and the bad money kept circulating. The inflation accelerated. Frustrated by the market's refusal to obey him, Diocletian did what almost every desperate dictator in history has done since. He decided to ban inflation by decree. In the year 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. It was the most comprehensive attempt at price controls in human history. The edict was carved into stone tablets and set up in the market square of every major city in the Greek East. We still have fragments of these stones today. They listed over 1,000 specific goods and services and mandated the maximum price that could be charged for them. A modius of wheat could not cost more than 100 denarii. A sextarius of high-quality wine was capped at 30 denarii. It even regulated labor wages. A farm laborer could not be paid more than 25 denarii a day. A carpenter was capped at 50 denarii. The preamble to the edict was terrifying. Diocletian described merchants as avaricious men who were destroying the empire with their greed. He didn't blame the debased currency, he blamed the shopkeepers. And the penalty for violating the edict? Death. If you sold a bushel of wheat for 101 denarii instead of 100, you were executed. If you were a buyer and you paid 101 denarii because you were starving and desperate, you were executed. The result was exactly what modern economists would predict, but to the Romans, it was a shock. The economy simply stopped. Merchants couldn't sell their goods at the government price because it cost them more than that just to bring the goods to market. So, they closed their shops. Farmers stopped bringing food into the cities. The shelves went empty. The black market exploded. People began to trade in secret, risking their lives to buy bread at the real market price, which was vastly higher than the emperor's fantasy price. The historian Lactantius, who lived through this, wrote, "Much blood was shed for very slight and trifling causes, and nothing was brought to market because of fear. The price rise got much worse until, after the death of many, the law was repealed from mere necessity. Diocletian's reforms failed to save the currency, but they succeeded in changing the soul of the empire. To enforce these tax collections and price controls, the Roman state had to become a surveillance state. The tax collectors became the most feared men in the village. They would torture citizens to reveal where they had hidden their grain or their silver. But while the currency collapsed for the poor, a new reality was emerging for the rich. This brings us to Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. Constantine is famous for converting the empire to Christianity, but his financial conversion was just as impactful. He recognized that the silver denarius was dead. It was beyond saving. The trust was gone. So he abandoned the silver standard entirely and shifted the Roman Empire to a gold standard. He introduced the solidus. It was a small gold coin weighing 4.5 grams of pure gold. It was a masterpiece of stability. Unlike the silver coins, the emperors never debased the gold solidus. For the next 700 years, through the fall of the West and into the Byzantine era, the solidus remained pure. It became known as the dollar of the Middle Ages. This sounds like a success story, but it wasn't. It was the final nail in the coffin for the average Roman. By switching to gold, Constantine created a two-tiered society. The military officers, the high bureaucrats, and the super-rich were paid in gold solidus. They had access to stable money that held its value. But the poor, the farmers, the laborers, the shopkeepers, they never saw a gold coin in their lives. They were stuck using the billions of worthless copper coins still floating around. This destroyed the social mobility of Rome. In the old days, a thrifty farmer could save up silver denarii and eventually buy more land. Now, he was saving in a currency that was hyperinflating, while the land he wanted to buy was priced in gold. The gap between the rich and the poor became an unbridgeable canyon. The government demanded taxes in gold. If you were a small farmer and you only had copper or wheat, you had to sell your crops at a massive discount to get the gold needed to pay the tax collector. If you couldn't pay, you lost your land to the wealthy aristocrats who had plenty of gold. The small free farmers of Rome, the backbone of the legions, were wiped out. They were forced to sell their land to massive mega-plantations and work as tenant farmers or colony. They were bound to the soil, unable to leave. This was the birth of feudalism. The Middle Ages didn't begin when Rome fell. They began financially right here, with the death of the silver currency and the rise of the gold elite. As the 4th century dragged on, the Roman economy was hollowed out. The cities were shrinking because it was too expensive to live in them. The trade routes were withering. And then the barbarians came. But they didn't come to destroy Rome. They came to be paid by it. For centuries, Rome had used its wealth to bribe barbarian tribes to stay away or to fight for them as mercenaries. But now, Rome had no real wealth left, only the illusion of it. The treasury was empty of gold because the tax base had been destroyed. The year 410 AD marks the psychological end. Alaric the Goth marched his army to the gates of Rome and laid siege to the city. The Senate, terrified, sent envoys to ask Alaric what it would take for him to leave. Alaric didn't ask for land. He didn't ask for titles. He knew the only thing that mattered. He demanded specific, hard assets. He demanded 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 scarlet hides, and 3,000 pounds of pepper. The Senate was horrified. To pay this ransom, they had to strip the gold and silver ornaments off the statues of the old Roman gods. They had to melt down the legacy of their ancestors to pay off a warlord because their economy could no longer produce a surplus. They paid him, and he left for a while. But the message was clear to the world. Rome was bankrupt. The final collapse in 476 AD, when the last Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed, wasn't a bang. It was a whimper. The state could no longer pay the mercenary army of Odoacer, so the army simply decided to stop pretending there was an empire. They took the land instead of the pay. The 5% mistake of Nero had compounded over 400 years into a total liquidation of the state. But the story doesn't end with the fall of Rome. The ghost of the denarius haunts us today. The exact same pattern, debasement, inflation, price controls, and the destruction of the middle class, has repeated in every dying empire since. And as we look at the modern financial system, at the trillions being printed and the debt piling up, we have to ask ourselves, are we in the age of Augustus, or are we staring at the smoke rising from Nero's fire? If you plot the value of the Roman denarius from the time of Augustus to the fall of Rome on a graph, you see a line that stays flat for a while, dips slowly, and then crashes vertically into zero. It is a terrifying image of wealth destruction. But here is the most disturbing part of this story. If you take a chart of the US dollar ounce purchasing power from the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 to today, the two lines are nearly identical. The Roman Empire didn't collapse because of a single war or a single plague. It collapsed because it forgot the definition of money. And right now, the modern world is suffering from the exact same amnesia. The parallels are not just vague similarities, they are mathematical mirrors. Nero's 5% mistake in 64 AD was the decision to sever the currency from its physical reality. In the modern era, our Nero moment happened on August 15, 1971. That was the day President Richard Nixon stood on television and temporarily suspended the convertibility of the US dollar into gold. Just like Nero, he promised it was to stabilize the economy. Just like Nero, he said it was for the good of the citizens. And just like Nero, he unleashed a monster he could not control. Before 1971, the US government was constrained. If they wanted to spend money, they had to tax it or borrow it honestly. After 1971, the restraint was gone. The US dollar became a fiat currency, Latin for let it be done. It has value only because the government says it does. Since that day, the US dollar has lost over 87% of its purchasing power. If you go back to 1913, it has lost over 97%. We are effectively living in the age of the copper denarius, but we call it quantitative easing. Look at the bread and circuses. In Rome, the emperors kept the population docile, with free grain and brutal games at the Colosseum. Today, we have the largest entitlement spending in human history. In 2020 alone, the U.S. government printed nearly 20% of all U.S. dollars that had ever existed to fund stimulus checks and bailouts. The method of delivery has changed, digital deposits instead of grain sacks. But the economic mechanism is exactly the same, buying social peace with devalued currency. We also see the return of the two-tiered society that Constantine solidified with his gold solidus. Today, we don't have legally distinct coins for the rich and poor, but we have the Cantillon effect. This is an economic observation that when the state prints money, the first people to get it, the banks, the corporations, the hedge funds, get to spend it before prices rise. They buy up the assets, the stocks, the real estate, the gold. By the time that new money trickles down to the average worker's wages, prices have already skyrocketed. This is why the stock market can be at an all-time high, while the average family cannot afford a home. The rich are living in the gold standard economy of asset inflation, while the poor are trapped in the copper standard economy of wage stagnation. It is the Roman tragedy replaying in high definition. Even the military parallel is striking. Rome destroyed its currency to pay for a military it could no longer afford. The U.S. currently spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined, all while running a national debt that is accelerating past $34 trillion. The interest payments alone on that debt are now rising to rival the defense budget itself. This is the death spiral. When you have to print money just to pay the interest on the money you printed yesterday, the mathematical end is certain. It is not a matter of if, but when. So what happens next? If history is our guide, we know the ending. Rome didn't disappear, the people didn't vanish, but the structure dissolved. The centralized power of Rome shattered into decentralized feudalism. The complex trade routes broke down into local networks. We are seeing the early signs of this fracture today. There are BRICS. Nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are actively buying gold at record rates, the highest central bank gold buying in 50 years. They are doing exactly what Alaric the Goth did in 410 AD, demanding payment in hard assets, not in the promises of a fading empire. They are preparing for a world where the dollar, like the denarius, is no longer the king. For the individual investor, the lesson of the Roman collapse is survival. The Romans who trusted the state and held onto their copper denarii lost everything. They starved. The Romans who saw the writing on the wall, the Neros of the private sector, traded their currency for land, for gold, for silver, and for productive businesses. They insulated themselves from the debasement. History is a wheel. It turns slowly, so slowly that a single human life often can't see the motion. But the spokes are the same, the hub is the same, and the crushing weight is the same. The 5% mistake wasn't just about silver content. It was about the arrogant belief that a government can defy the laws of mathematics. Nero learned the hard way that you cannot. Diocletian learned it. And soon, the modern central banks will learn it too. The empire doesn't fall in a day. It falls 1 percentage point at a time, until suddenly, all at once, the trust evaporates. The Roman citizen in 400 AD likely woke up thinking the empire would last forever. But by dinner time, he was melting down his jewelry to pay a barbarian. The question is not whether the cycle will end. The question is, when the music stops, what will you be holding in your hand? A promise or the real thing?